The smell of fixative and stop-bath chemicals is supposed to be comforting. For a film photographer, the darkroom is a sanctuary, a place where time is suspended and the truth of a moment is slowly pulled out of the dark and onto the paper. But right now, standing in the cramped windowless bathroom of this roadside motel, with a single red safe light burning above the sink, I'm shaking so violently I can barely hold the tongs. I am watching an image slowly materialize in the chemical tray. It's a photograph I took yesterday at high noon. A simple, wide-angle shot of the interior of my Ford Bronco, framing the long, empty stretch of asphalt ahead. But as the silver halides darken, a shape emerges in the background of the image. Standing perfectly still in the back seat of my car, clearly visible in the rearview mirror, is the misty figure of a woman in a white 1940s-era dress. Her head is bowed, her face is shadowed. I took this photograph 8 hours before I ever picked her up. She was already there. She was waiting. If stories like this keep finding you after dark, subscribe to Horror Whisper. Some things are easier to face when you're not alone. My name is Elias. I am an urban explorer, but mostly I document the dead. Not people, towns. I shoot on expired 35mm stock, capturing the decaying ruins of the old alignment, the bypassed stretches of Route 66 that the interstate left to rot in the Mojave sun. I've always felt a strange guilt about it, a heavy lingering shame, like the way I felt when I drove away from the nursing home after leaving my grandfather there for the last time. That same feeling of abandoning something that still has a pulse just because the modern world decided it was no longer convenient. I thought I was just taking pictures. I didn't realize that every time I triggered the shutter, I was giving a piece of myself to the asphalt. The nightmare didn't begin with a scream. It began with the engine dying. It was 3 a.m. I was driving a desolate stretch near the ruins of the Twin Arrows trading post in Arizona. The radio had been dead static for 50 miles. The kind of deep, geographic isolation where the asphalt narrows, the darkness presses against the windows, and you suddenly realize you are entirely alone in a 300-mile unpatrolled corridor. No water, no fuel, no assistance. The Bronco shuddered, the dashboard lights flickered, and the engine simply cut out. I coasted to a silent, heavy stop on the gravel shoulder of Dead Man's Curve. I sat there for a moment, the ticking of the cooling engine the only sound in the desert void. Then, over the dead frequencies of the unplugged AM radio, a voice whispered through the static, "Elias." A sharp chill shot up my spine. The radio dial wasn't just off. The wiring harness was loose behind the dash. Before I could process it, I heard a sound from outside, just beyond the reach of my fading headlights, the distinct, metallic click of a car door opening. But it wasn't my door. I grabbed my flashlight, my heart hammering against my ribs, and stepped out into the biting desert cold. The beam of my light cut through the blackness, sweeping over the dry sagebrush, the cracked pavement, and finally settling on a figure standing on the shoulder of the road. It was a woman. She was dressed in a pristine, white, mid-century dress, the fabric swaying slightly even though there was no wind. She looked incredibly forlorn, her edges almost misty, blending into the ambient dark. "Hey," I called out, my voice sounding incredibly small in the vast emptiness. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" She didn't speak. She didn't even look at my face. She slowly raised one pale hand and pointed to a faded, brittle paper map she was holding against her chest. I stepped closer, the crunch of my boots on the gravel sounding abnormally loud. I looked down at where her trembling finger was pressing into the paper. She was pointing to a town called Baghdad. Baghdad, California, was physically removed from the map decades ago. It was bulldozed into the sand. There was nothing there but scorpions and scrub oak. I should have gotten back in my car. I should have locked the doors and waited for dawn. But the absolute terror of being stranded out here, combined with a strange, hypnotic pull in her silence, made me act against every survival instinct I had. I told her to get in. She slid into the back seat without a word. I turned the key in the ignition. The engine, which had been completely dead 2 minutes ago, roared to life instantly. I pulled back onto the highway, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles ached. The silence in the car was suffocating. It felt crowded. The air was thick, smelling faintly of ozone and old, dry dust. I glanced at the dashboard. My stomach dropped into a bottomless pit of ice. The odometer. The mechanical numbers on the dial were moving. They were spinning backward. 43,010, 43,009, 43,008. I looked up at the rearview mirror. The woman was sitting perfectly still, but her silhouette was distorting, shifting like smoke trapped in a jar. Then, the unplugged radio began to emit a faint, scratchy melody. An old big band tune, distorted by layers of time and interference. In the back seat, the woman began to hum along with it. I pressed my foot on the gas. I needed to find a town, a gas station, a street light, anything to tether me back to the modern world. Up ahead, the sickly green glow of flickering neon cut through the dark. A town. The sign on the edge of the road read, Cuervo. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding and took the off-ramp. But as I drove down the main street, the relief instantly curdled into a new, sharper kind of dread. The streetlights overhead were only illuminated on the left side of the road. The right side was swallowed by an impenetrable blackness. We passed an old, abandoned service station with a collapsed roof and a distinctive bent front door. Next to the gas pumps was the rusted, skeletal frame of a 1930s coupe, half buried in the dirt. I kept driving. 10 minutes passed. The town seemed abnormally long, just endless rows of darkened storefronts and boarded-up motels. 15 minutes. The road curved. Suddenly my headlights swept over a collapsed service station with a bent front door. Next to it, the exact same rusted chassis of a 1930s coupe. I slammed on the brakes. The tires squealed against the pavement. I'd been driving in a straight line at 50 miles an hour. It was physically impossible to pass the same building from the same direction. "What is this?" I demanded, turning around to face the back seat. "What's happening?" She didn't look at me. She just kept pointing at the map. I slammed the car into drive and floored it, tearing out of the town limits and back onto the open highway. The road was changing. It didn't feel like driving anymore. It felt like I was being swallowed. The wide vistas of New Mexico began to feel artificial, claustrophobic, like a massive cinema set where the distant mountains were just the painted bones of a forgotten country. Then, up ahead in the distance, I saw Salvation, a building, bright lights, the Midpoint Cafe. There were cars parked in the dirt lot. Real, modern cars. Through the wide glass windows, I could see silhouettes sitting at the booths. I could see a waitress standing behind the counter. Warm, yellow light spilled out onto the pavement. "Okay," I muttered, my hands shaking. "Okay, we're stopping here. I'm getting help." I pulled the Bronco in hot, kicking up a cloud of dust, and threw it into park. I didn't wait for the girl in the back. I threw my door open and sprinted toward the diner. I grabbed the heavy metal handle and yanked the door open. The little silver bell above the frame chimed cheerfully. "Hey, I need some help out here. My car is..." The words died in my throat. The diner was perfectly illuminated. The jukebox in the corner was glowing, humming a faint bass line. But there was no one speaking. There was no clatter of silverware. There was no smell of coffee or grease. I took a slow, terrified step inside. The man sitting at the nearest booth, wearing a trucker hat and a plaid shirt, wasn't a man. He was an old fiberglass department store mannequin. His painted eyes stared blankly at the wall. I looked at the woman sitting across from him, a mannequin. I looked at the waitress behind the counter, a mannequin, her rigid plastic hand eternally resting on the handle of a coffee pot. My breath hitched in my chest. I slowly walked over to the counter. I looked down at the slice of cherry pie sitting on a white ceramic plate. I reached out and touched it. It was cold. It was hard. It was carved, painted stone. The coffee in the mugs was solid brown resin. The jukebox in the corner was humming, but through the glass I could see the internal carousel was completely empty. There were no records. It was a diorama, a physical manifestation of a memory, painstakingly reconstructed by something that didn't truly understand what human life was. I backed away, my chest heaving, a primal scream building in my lungs. I stumbled out the front door, the bell chiming happily behind me, and sprinted back to my car. The back seat was empty. The girl was gone. But sitting on the passenger seat, right where I had left my camera bag, was a small torn piece of yellowed paper. I picked it up. It was a postal cancellation stamp, a heart-shaped Cupid stamp from a town called Valentine. It was wet. I rubbed the moisture between my fingers, bringing it to my nose. It smelled like sulfur and burning earth. It was quicklime, the chemical used to dissolve bodies in unmarked graves. I threw the paper out the window, slammed the car into gear, and tore back onto the highway. The darkness outside was total. The stars above were gone, replaced by a suffocating ceiling of black. I looked at the dashboard clock. It had been 3 a.m. for the last 2 hours. The sun was trapped, suspended somewhere far below the horizon, refusing to rise. Suddenly, a massive, violent force slammed into the driver's side of my car. The Bronco violently swerved into the opposing lane. I fought the wheel, screaming, expecting the sickening crunch of metal, the shattering of glass. But there was no sound of impact, just the physical jolt, like an invisible fist had struck the frame. I regained control, my heart threatening to explode, and looked in the side mirror. A heavy black sedan was driving parallel to me in the desert dirt. It had no headlights, no reflection in the moonlight. It was just a void tearing through the sagebrush. I could see the steering wheel through the window. There was no one driving it. It swerved aggressively toward me again. I slammed on the brakes, letting the phantom car shoot past me and vanish into the darkness ahead as if it had never existed. I pulled over, my whole body trembling with shock. I was hyperventilating, gripping the steering wheel so hard my fingernails dug into my palms. Then, in the rearview mirror, a burst of red and blue light painted the interior of my car. A police cruiser. Relief, pure and absolute, washed over me. A state trooper. Someone real. Someone with a radio. I threw the door open and stepped out onto the highway, waving my arms frantically. Hey! Hey, over here! The cruiser was parked 50 feet behind me, the emergency lights flashing silently, casting long, erratic shadows across the desert floor. Officer, please, you have to help me. Someone just tried to run me off the road. I jogged toward the cruiser, squinting against the strobe lights. But as I closed the distance, the shape of the car began to resolve in the dark. The relief vanished, replaced by a cold, numbing horror that paralyzed my legs. It wasn't a modern police interceptor. It was a 1950s Ford mainline. The paint was entirely rusted away, leaving a jagged brown shell. The tires were flat, rotted, and melted into the asphalt. The windows were gone. As I approached the driver's side, peering into the cab, My stomach heaved. The interior was filled with decades of tumbleweeds, sand, and dust. The steering column was heavily rusted. There was no engine under the hood. There was no battery. Yet the red and blue lights on the roof continued to spin, humming with a heavy dark energy, running on absolutely nothing. It was a trap. Right then, in the glow of those impossible lights, the midpoint of the nightmare finally clicked into place. My understanding of the road shattered. Dead Man's Curve wasn't just a dangerous turn. It was a zone, an intersection of tragedies. I suddenly understood why my camera was acting strange. Why the film stock I'd been developing was always plagued by unexplainable light leaks. They weren't technical errors. They were ghostly semi-trucks, hellhounds, violently burning their impressions through the celluloid. Every time I took a photograph of these abandoned towns, I thought I was preserving them. I wasn't. I was feeding them. The road is a living, starving thing. As the modern world bypassed it, as the towns dried up and the people vanished, the road began to fade. And a road that is forgotten dies. To stay alive, it needs residence. It needs memory. It was memorizing me. I ran back to my car, terrified that if I stood still for too long, I would turn into fiberglass and stone. I drove for what felt like days. The landscape completely broke down. The pavement beneath my tires turned into black gumbo mud, a thick, wet sludge that swallowed the treads of my tires, a physical impossibility in the arid Mojave Desert. I could hear the heavy breathing of cave rocks echoing from the unsung canyons. My own mind began to betray me. I looked at the passenger seat and suddenly remembered the Saturday night fights behind a dive bar in a town called Ende. I could smell the spilled beer. I could feel the bruises on my knuckles. I have never been to a town called Ende. The memories weren't mine. They were being downloaded into my brain, overwriting my past, preparing me to become a permanent fixture. I looked in the rearview mirror. The reflection staring back at me wasn't Elias. It was a shadowy, indistinct figure wearing a black top hat. The face was just a blur of static. "No," I cried, slapping the steering wheel. "No, I am real. I am leaving." Up ahead, another neon sign broke the darkness. The Blue Swallow Motel. The lights were warm. The parking lot was paved and clean. Through the office window, I could see an older man sitting behind the desk, reading a newspaper. I didn't care if it was a trick. I didn't care if he was a mannequin. I just needed 4 walls and a locked door. I pulled under the awning and ran into the office. The man behind the desk looked up, folding his newspaper. He had kind eyes, deep wrinkles. He looked incredibly real. "Rough night out there on the Mother Road?" he asked, his voice thick with a genuine gravelly warmth. "I need a room," I gasped, slapping my hands on the desk. "I don't care how much. I just need a room." He smiled softly. He didn't ask for a credit card. He didn't ask for my ID. He just reached under the counter, pulled out a heavy tarnished brass key attached to a red plastic diamond, and slid it across the glass. "Room 1, he said quietly. "It's been waiting for you." I snatched the key, mumbled a thank you, and sprinted back out into the cold night air. Room 1 was at the end of the courtyard. I shoved the key into the lock, turned it, and practically fell inside, slamming the heavy wooden door shut behind me. I threw the deadbolt. I latched the chain. I collapsed against the door, sliding down to the carpet, burying my face in my hands, sobbing. I was safe. The room was quiet. The hum of the mini-fridge was a beautiful modern sound. After a few minutes, I pulled myself up. I needed to wash my face. I reached for the light switch and flicked it on. The warm yellow light flooded the room. I froze. The furniture in the room was pristine. but attached to the handle of the dresser, dangling by a piece of twine, was an original delivery tag, dated 1940. I slowly turned my head toward the bed. Sitting at the foot of the mattress was a leather suitcase. Next to it was an old canvas camera bag. They were my bags, but they were covered in a thick, undisturbed layer of gray dust, an inch of rot and time. They looked like they had been sitting in this exact spot, untouched, for 80 years. My heart stopped beating. The air in my lungs turned to ash. I walked over to the wooden nightstand on trembling legs. I pulled the small drawer open. Inside, resting on top of a Gideon Bible, was a folded piece of paper. I picked it up. The paper was brittle, yellowed with age. It was a police report, a missing person file from the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department. I opened it. Staring back at me was a black and white photograph of my own face. Name, Elias. Age, 29. Occupation, photographer. Date of disappearance, October 14th, 1967. The room began to spin. A high-pitched ringing filled my ears. 1967. I looked down at my hands. They were pale. The edges of my fingers seemed to blur slightly into the air, losing their sharpness. It all came crashing down with the crushing weight of a collapsing bridge. The phantom hitchhiker. The girl in the white dress. She wasn't an evil spirit trying to kill me. She was a physical manifestation of the Green Book era. She was the ghost of a traveler who couldn't find a safe haven before sundown. In a sundown town, she had been stranded, terrified, left to the mercy of a hostile highway. The warning from a gas station clerk weeks ago, when I was first starting my photography project. Don't let dark catch you in town, son. I thought he was just a paranoid local. I thought he was warning me about crime. He wasn't. He was warning me about the road's memory. Route 66 isn't just an abandoned highway. It is a restricted entry zone of American trauma. A massive, stretching scar across the desert that absorbed thousands of deaths, disappearances, and heartbreaks over decades. And it can only cleanse that grief. It can only keep existing by claiming new souls to replace the ones it lost. The hitchhiker wasn't looking for a ride home. She was leading me to my permanent residence. I backed away from the nightstand, bumping into the dusty suitcase. I had to leave. Now. I unbolted the door, threw it open, and ran into the parking lot. The motel office was dark. The neon sign was shattered. The entire building was a collapsed, graffiti-covered ruin. I sprinted to my Bronco, threw myself into the driver's seat, and jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, a deafening sound in the absolute silence. I peeled out of the ruined motel lot, tearing back onto the highway. The accelerator pressed completely to the floor. I didn't care where I was going. I just drove. The road began to dissolve around me. The mountains flattened into nothingness. The pavement gave way to an endless flat expanse of white salt and dead earth. The Mojave Triangle. The electronics in the car died instantly. The headlights flickered and went black. The engine sputtered, choked, and died. The Bronco coasted in the pitch-black void, slowing down, losing momentum, until it rolled to a gentle stop beneath a solitary wooden sign, illuminated only by the moonlight. The sign read, "End of the trail." But there was no Pacific Ocean. There was no Santa Monica Pier. There was only an infinite, suffocating sea of sand. I sat there in the dark. The sound of a swinging bell rope in an empty church echoed from somewhere deep in the desert. Then I heard it. The click of the passenger door. I didn't turn my head. I couldn't. I just stared straight ahead into the blackness as the seat next to me sank under a weight. I looked at the rearview mirror. My reflection wasn't shadowy anymore. It was crystal clear. I was wearing a black top hat. My eyes were hollow. My skin was gray. I slowly opened my door and stepped out into the cold desert wind. I turned and looked back at my vehicle. It wasn't a Ford Bronco anymore. It was a rusted, hollowed-out 1950s shell. Its tires melted into the asphalt, sitting silently next to the ruins of a gas station with a bent front door. The road had finished its work. It had corrected itself. I walked away from the wreckage, wandering into the dark where the town of Baghdad used to be. I found a fragile, solitary, dead tree standing in the center of the wasteland. I took my Leica M6 camera from around my neck, the leather strap worn and familiar, and hung it over a dry, jagged branch. I left it there, a tombstone for a life that the modern world will never realize is missing. I am writing this from a place I cannot describe, a place where the sun is always suspended exactly halfway through sunset. I finally understand my role. The road cannot die. It must continue. I am standing on the shoulder of Dead Man's Curve now. My silhouette is misty in the cold night air. I am holding a map to a town that doesn't exist. I am waiting for headlights to pierce the darkness. Because if I am the hitchhiker now, who is the driver currently approaching the Twin Arrow stop? This is Horror Whisper.